My friends, Joe Biden's mindless monetary policies have already sparked massive inflation. We hit the highest rates since 2008 just last week. If his profligate spending continues, hyperinflation is around the corner, as is a complete economic meltdown here in the United States once America can no longer finance our debt. David Stockman, Ronald Reagan's budget director and founder of the Contra Corner newsletter, joining us now to talk about all of this. Sir, welcome back to the Chris Salcedo Show. A lot to cover in a very short period of time here, so let's get right to it.
Okay.
On top of his already massive China virus spending, that was not spending on the China virus, on top of his already planned infrastructure spending that isn't really infrastructure spending, Biden wants to increase the federal annual budget from around $4 trillion to $6 trillion. As you know, inflation hurts minorities, women, the working poor the hardest. What will his spending plans do to inflation?
Well, nothing good. As you said, we spent $6 trillion on COVID relief when the GDP loss was about $800 billion. So that was like 7 times overkill. Then Biden comes in with all of his infrastructure programs that aren't really infrastructure and going to add another $4 trillion on top of the 6, which is on top of everything that's already there. So we have basically what I call an infernal inflation machine in Washington. The politicians, and really it's both parties, the Democrats are worse and Biden's the worst yet, but they spend and borrow like there's no tomorrow, there's no limits. The Fed then steps in and runs the printing press red hot, and in the last year alone, they printed $4 trillion of new money, 8 out of the 8 trillion that we have. And then, of course, all that liquidity flows into Wall Street, and they, speculate and gamble till the cows come home. And so we have record stocks and bonds and NFTs and cryptos and, meme stocks and everything else. The whole system is out of kilter. It's out of control. And it starts with borrowing and money printing. And we're only heading deeply into the wrong direction.
Well, let me ask you, is hyperinflation already here?
Well, look, we've had serious inflation for a long time. It's just been hidden. I know in the last 25 years, the domestic services sector has been inflating at about 3% a year, even though the Fed keeps saying there's not enough inflation. If you could imagine the central bank complaining there's not enough inflation. Now, the only reason that some of the indices looked to be lower was that we had a one-time 25-year episode of goods deflation, durable goods deflation coming out of China as they took over the world's factory floor. But that's over and done. Our imports from China rose from 45 billion in 1995 to 550 billion a couple years ago. That's receding now. Their costs are rising. We're in a huge diplomatic, technological, and political fight with China. So we're not going to have the downdraft of all of that deflation in goods. So with services rising, goods are now up 7-8% on a year-over-year basis. We're heading now for the worst inflation that we've had in goods and services for 30 or 40 years, on top of the massive inflation that we've had in financial assets all along. So this is a very dangerous time. And I think people need to really be concerned about, what's going to come around the bend, because it's not going to be very pleasant.
No, and we were just showing there the debt clock. It's just cascading out of control. Will the Fed raise interest rates? And if they do, what's going to happen?
If the Fed raises interest rates, the whole house of cards will come tumbling down. We now have on this economy, and I'm talking public sector and private, 83 trillion of debt, which is about 40 trillion more than we had at the time of the financial crisis, when everybody said we had too much debt then. We learned nothing. The Fed made it so easy to borrow that both government and the federal sector went crazy. We got 28 trillion of debt there, but businesses and households borrowed like crazy as well. And so no one can afford any increase in interest rates. And yet interest rates today at 1.5%, are way, way under the inflation rate. That isn't a sustainable, equation. That can't last, because sooner or later, interest rates have to rise, whether the Fed wants it or not, to catch up with inflation, which is accelerating rapidly.
Well,
so I think we're near the day of reckoning with all of this debt, starting with the 28 trillion and rapidly rising. You probably noticed, I think viewers noticed, in the first 8 months of this year, the deficit was 2.1 trillion, a record, even though allegedly the economy is recovering rapidly and the stock market is at an all-time high. And Biden's in there wanting to pump in even more trillions on top of everything we've already spent. This doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I've only got about 45 seconds left, and I want to get this last question in, because if everything happens as you're saying, will stocks get hammered if this is all triggered of hyperinflation? Will they get hammered? And where can people go for refuge? Can they go to gold?
Yes, they need to go to gold, and they need to get out of harm's way. The bond market is a huge bubble waiting to collapse. The stock market is more, out of control, is in a greater bubble than ever before in history. The minute interest rates finally start to rise, the minute the Fed has to face down the rapidly accelerating inflation, the whole thing is going to come unravel. The reason, for instance, the tech stocks are so high today is because, the argument is there's no other alternative, and interest rates are so low, you can afford to put a very high PE multiple on these stocks. But once interest rates start rising, which they will, it's unavoidable, it's going to happen, then, PE multiples are going to come way down, stocks are going to go into a big correction, and there's going to be a lot of carnage in the financial market. So get out of stocks, get out of bonds, get into gold, stay liquid, and prepare for the worst. I think there's really not much alternative.
David Stockman, appreciate the time and the expertise here on the Salcedo Show. It's not a pretty picture. Coming up.